I made these pattern plane shavings a few years ago. It's a Japanese craft known as Yosegi. I also made another pattern not long after, and I've been itching to try it again. Here's the new design, which I made in Shaper 3D. I should warn you now that there's a lot of work to end up with just one block, but hopefully if I get my plane blade sharp enough, I'll get a fair few shavings from it. For the contrast, I'll use black wattle and regular old pine. I've worked out my dimensions, so the first thing I'll do is make a bunch of dowels. If I made dowels lengthways, that wouldn't work, as the end of the dowel would be end grain and I need the ends to be face grain. I'll make them with hole saws, and I'll do that at 3 different sizes. That's the first size done in the black wattle. It only took about 10 minutes, so I'll keep going and do the rest of them. They're all oversized and need turning down later on, so it doesn't matter that they look a bit rough now at this stage. And they're actually all pretty quick to make. They didn't take too long at all. Now I'll move on to the next stage, which will involve my lathe, but not my wood turning one. Instead, I'll use the metalwork lathe, which will help keep things precise and repeatable. I'll be holding the pieces in collets, but the biggest dowels are 25mm and the largest collet I have is 20. So the first thing I'll do is turn a tenon on one end of all the bigger pieces. I'll use the 3-jaw chuck for this operation, but I'll be holding the workpiece in the collet chuck from then on, and that will be far more accurate. I'll set a stop to make the process quick and easy. While I finish those, I'll let you know about my marking knife, also known as the dart, which I'm pretty excited about. After months of design and revision, you can now get your hands on one, and for the next little bit, if you purchase the dart, not only will you be able to get the marking knife at a special launch price, I've also included 11 of my premium plans as a bonus to say thank you for all the support. So make sure to click the link in the description to check out my Pask Makes marking knife and take advantage of the limited time price and bonuses, as they won't be available for long. And as always, thanks for the support. That's all the pieces ready to go, so now I'll start drilling and fitting them together. I'll start by drilling a hole in the dark piece at 23mm and then turn this one down to fit in. The outside does need turning down to 25mm, but I'll do that later on. From now on, I can hold all the pieces in the collet chuck, but I still need to be careful though. The wood is soft and it's still easy enough to mount it slightly crooked. I don't have a 23mm forcing bit, even though they do exist, so I'll just have to drill it out to 20mm and then bore the rest out with a boring bar. This fit is the only one I need to do this for. All the other ones afterwards, I have the correct size drill bit for them. I drilled them all first, so now I can bore them out. I got a bit heavy-handed here and there and I blew a few of them out, but I got the hole saw back out and I remade a few more spares, so they're all done. Next I need to turn down the pine ones and fit into them. I also made a high-speed steel cutter which should get a cleaner cut. I'm drilling the centre for 2 reasons. One, for the air to escape when gluing the pine piece into the black wattle, and also to help recenter the piece when I mount it in the collet chuck again later on. It really is a crazy amount of work and I'm hardly into the project yet, but anyway, the first pieces are ready to glue. I knew the project was a lot of work, but I reckon sometimes when you have an idea, you just have to see it through and go for it, even if it isn't the most productive. And I have no idea if this is even going to work, but we'll find out. I'll trim off the ends, then drill them ready for the next dowels. I'm using the drill to help centre them, but the odd hole didn't drill very central in the first place, so I should have probably used a thicker drill bit with less flex. I'm definitely figuring better ways of doing things on this project, even though I'll probably never do it again. This time I'm drilling them out with an 18mm Forstner bit. It's not the best quality, but it's the only one I have in this size. They came out pretty good, and most of them are just about perfect. There's the odd one or two that didn't quite come out concentric, but these will never be a complete ring. So once they're split up into sections, I think they'll be fine, as long as they don't get any worse than that. Next, I need to turn down these plugs, and they're almost the right size already. They just need a tiny amount taken off to fit them in. The high-speed steel cutter is doing a great job, and it was definitely worth switching over to. I didn't drill a hole for the air to escape. I should have done, but anyway, with the use of clamps, it all went together fine. I gave up with the idea of using the drill bit to centre them. While they're drying, I'll start turning down the next pine dowels. I turned them in two halves. I did the one end first on all the pieces, then changed the collets, and then did the other end. Now I can get back to the main pieces and trim them and drill them out. I'm using a 16mm bit for this, which leaves a pretty thin ring. Again, this bit isn't the best, but it'll work. I do have a set of very good Forstner bits, but they only go up in 5mm increments. Then I have quite a few of them like this one, which are handy now and again, but they really aren't that good. The ones that are less concentric are a bit trickier to do. There's not much material to play with, and that inner ring is only 1mm thick. So what I am going to do is drill them out on the milling machine, where I think I can line it up a bit easier and make finer adjustments. And where this all went wrong is I didn't make the tenons long enough in the first place. If I'd have done that, they would have stayed more concentric. And the reason I didn't is I wanted this to be as long as possible, which would have meant a thicker block and more plain shavings, but in hindsight I should have made the tenon longer. This should be a better method, but it's adding a lot of work to an already crazy workload. It's easier to see where it's going to drill, and as the ring is so thin, I don't want to drill slightly off and into the pine. Also, the milling machine is far more rigid than the tailstock of the lathe, which I reckon introduced some of these errors in the first place. That worked well, but I still need to turn down the outside of them, so I made a guide from scrap aluminium to help line them up. I did think about starting the whole project again and use longer tenons, which would have made things so much easier, but I decided to keep going. Now I have another problem. The end grain on the side of the pieces is blowing out. I did think at this point that maybe I should give up the whole project and move on to something else, but I decided to try stabilising the end grain with some thin CA glue. The CA glue is dry to touch, but while it's fully setting, I glued in the next dowels. I gave them a quick sand just so I could clearly see the ends to line them up on the lathe. It's not perfect, but close enough. I think I should have probably started again, but at least the CA glue worked out, and one way or another I should end up with a pattern block. Whether I get a good shaving from it's another matter, but fingers crossed it works out. I also made a few pieces that will be needed for a border later on. I drilled the bottom of the main piece as the dowels are getting thinner and a bit weaker, so they definitely need the air to escape when pushing them in. Even though I managed up until now, I should have done this when gluing in all of the dowels. Just the last dowels to go, and I had to feed the cutter very slowly and sharpen it regularly as the dowels with the grain orientation were extremely weak. And that's the last pieces going in, and I really am super happy about that. I'm not sure how this has come across in the video, but it's been a huge amount of work and there's still plenty to go. Next I'll square up one end and then cut them into segments. I can just about get the pattern from these segments, but I need to use a saw with a thin kerf, else there'll be too much waste and they'll end up too small. It's a pretty straightforward jig, but it works well. I brought out my mini workbench just to get a more comfortable work height, and I've also been using this anti-fatigue mat throughout the project, which my wife bought me, and it's fantastic. There's one last thing to do to these pieces, then hopefully they'll fit together and make the completed pattern. They need a couple of scallops cutting into them, and I'll do that with a simple jig on the milling machine. This was only going to be a test jig, but it worked so well I kept using it. I'm clamping the piece in with a washer and a screw, then drill one hole 10.5mm to the left of centre, then move the table over and drill the second hole 10.5mm to the right of centre. I wasn't sure how well this was going to work, but it worked perfectly. I didn't keep track of time on this project, but to give you some idea, this task took about 3 hours. I'm nearly ready to glue them together, but first I'll quickly make a border out of pine to glue the first row into. By the way, this is one of my good Forstner bits. It's a real pleasure to use and much better than the ones I showed earlier. Now I can glue it to a piece of plywood, which will be the base of the pattern block and keep it stable. There's still one thing left to do before gluing in the pieces. This edge will be trimmed after it's been glued, but the opposite edges where the border pieces that I showed earlier will be used. I need to cut them in half and then fit them with a bit of sanding. I'm working fast and using Type Bond 3, which gives me a bit more time than regular glue before it goes off. It didn't take too long though, it was about 15 minutes. As I'm putting it together, I'm liking the pattern. I'm honestly not sure whether it's worth all the work though, but it really does look very good. I left it overnight to dry, then next morning trimmed up the edges, the face and the ends. It needs a couple of blocks on the ends just to prevent the edges of the pattern tearing out, and then we can see whether I can get a good shaving. The plane blade needs to be super sharp, else this isn't going to happen. I've sharpened it to 6000 grit, but higher would be better. It's not perfect, but I've lowered the blade slightly and I'll try again. By the way, it helps to wipe the surface first with a damp rag. That's mostly intact and usable, but I sharpened the blade again and I got better results. The edge with the border segments is a bit weak, so I've decided to stabilise it by gluing on a strip. I'll then run it through the table saw and trim it back to the thickness of a veneer. While that's drying, I'll measure the thickness of the shaving with a micrometer. Thinner would be nicer as it means more shavings, but 1/3 of a millimetre isn't too bad and it'll let me get about 70 to 75 shavings from the block. Gluing on the edge definitely helped and made it more stable. I'm very happy with it. I'm not sure how I'm going to use the shavings yet, but if you check out my other Yosegi videos, you can see how I've used them before. It was a crazy amount of work, but I still enjoyed it. Hopefully you enjoyed the video too. Don't forget to check out the marking knives. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.